When you hear the word cannibal, you probably picture a monster from a movie. But what if I told you that for many ancient peoples, eating other humans wasn't about savagery, but about survival, spirituality, and even love? The real story behind why our ancestors practiced cannibalism is far more complicated and fascinating than you might think. Today we're going to uncover the desperate stories of survival, the brutal logic of warfare, and the surprising social rituals that led people to consume their own kind. We'll journey from the frozen mountains of the Sierra Nevada to the dense jungles of the Amazon, and travel back in time to the caves of Ice Age Europe. We're going to try and understand one of humanity's greatest taboos, not as a simple act of horror, but as a complex behavior that reveals startling truths about who we are and what we're capable of. Before we start, it helps to know how experts break this down. Anthropologists generally see two main types. First, there's exocannibalism. That's eating people from outside your social group, usually enemies you captured in a war. The second is endocannibalism. That's eating members of your own group, often as part of a funeral. This distinction is really important, because eating an enemy to steal their power is a world away from consuming a loved one to keep their spirit alive. We're going to explore both, starting with the most visceral and understandable reason anyone would do it: pure, gnawing starvation. For a long time, the image of the cannibal was reduced to a caricature, a savage, an uncivilized person from a primitive, far-off land. This image was convenient for colonial powers, who used it to draw a stark line between the civilized and the barbaric. It gave them moral license to conquer, convert, and dominate. But this popular narrative ignores a crucial truth. Some of the most well-documented, real-world cases of cannibalism didn't happen in isolated jungles or among so-called primitive tribes. They happened in the heart of so-called civilized societies, under the crushing weight of desperation. This form of cannibalism is called survival cannibalism, a last, horrifying resort when all other food is gone and death is just hours away. Survival cannibalism is not about ritual, revenge, or power. It's about making the most unthinkable choice in order to live one more day. It's a grim thread that runs quietly through human history, surfacing during famines, wars, sieges, shipwrecks, and failed expeditions. Moments when society breaks down and people are left with nothing but the primal urge to survive. One of the most haunting examples in American history, etched into textbooks, documentaries, and dark corners of cultural memory, is the Donner Party. In the spring of 1846, a group of families packed their wagons and set out from Illinois for the promise of a better life in California. They were hopeful, ambitious, and well-equipped for the journey, but a series of poor decisions, miscalculations, and an ill-advised shortcut led them into the Sierra Nevada mountains just as a devastating early winter rolled in. Snow piled dozens of feet deep, their wagons froze in place. There was no turning back. As the days turned to weeks and then to months, their food supply dwindled. First, they ate their pack animals, then boiled hides, then twigs and leather scraps. But when people began to die from starvation and cold, the survivors faced the unthinkable. They began to eat the bodies of the dead. One survivor, Patrick Breen, kept a chillingly calm diary of their ordeal. In one entry he wrote, "Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. In those snowbound cabins, surrounded by silence and death, human flesh became the only thing left to consume. There were no rituals, no ceremonies, just a grim, pragmatic decision: eat or die." This wasn't a one-time anomaly. All around the world, across centuries, similar stories have emerged, harrowing tales of people driven to eat the dead by the most basic biological instinct. In 15th century Egypt, records describe starving people hunting one another in the streets of Cairo during prolonged famine. In China, during the great famines of the 14th and 19th centuries, human flesh was sold in markets like salted pork. Some parents faced unspeakable choices, deciding which child would die so the others could live. In Ukraine, during the Holodomor famine of the 1930s, an event engineered by Stalin's policies, cannibalism was so widespread that the Soviet government passed specific laws outlawing it, though prosecuting it often meant acknowledging what was really happening. And in World War II, during the siege of Leningrad, there are first-hand accounts of people resorting to cannibalism when the temperature dropped and the rations vanished. These aren't stories of evil, they are stories of collapse, when systems, governments, and nature itself fail so completely that people revert to the barest instinct of survival. But what about our ancient ancestors? Did they make the same choices? For decades, archaeologists were hesitant to say yes. Early signs of cannibalism in the fossil record were often brushed aside. Cut marks on human bones were attributed to ritual burials or even animal scavenging. There was a reluctance to believe that early humans or even pre-humans would eat their own, but science, as it does, kept digging. At Grandolina, a cave in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, researchers found something stunning: the bones of Homo antecessor, a possible human ancestor who lived 800,000 years ago. Mixed among the remains of deer and bison were the bones of at least 11 individuals, mostly children and teenagers. These bones had the same kind of cut marks as the animal remains. They had been defleshed, disarticulated, and had their marrow extracted, clear signs of butchery. These weren't honored burials, they were meals. And this wasn't an isolated incident. At Moulagurzi, a cave in southeastern France, archaeologists found the bones of 6 Neanderthals who lived around 100,000 years ago. Their bodies had been butchered in exactly the same way as the deer remains found in the same cave. Bones broken to extract marrow, muscles stripped with stone tools. This was the Ice Age. The environment was harsh, resources were scarce, and big game had moved on. In those frozen caves, the bodies of the dead were not wasted, they were fuel for the living. To understand how archaeologists distinguish cannibalism from burial or scavenging, you have to look at taphonomy, the study of what happens to remains after death. If human bones show tool marks at the joints, and muscle attachment points, or spiral fractures typical of marrow extraction, that's a strong signal of intentional processing. If those bones are found mixed in with animal bones, discarded in the same refuse piles, the message becomes clear: in that moment, the human body was just another carcass. A fascinating 2017 study published in Scientific Reports took this idea further. Researchers tried to estimate the caloric value of a human body. What kind of nutritional return a cannibal would get? The answer: not much. A whole adult human yields about 125,000 calories. Compare that to a mammoth, which could provide over 3 million. Even horses or cattle would yield 10 times as much as a person, which suggests that cannibalism wasn't ever the most efficient option. It was always the last option. You didn't choose it unless you had to. But there's another layer. In some ancient sites like Grandolina, cannibalism seems too systematic to be purely about starvation. If plenty of animal remains are available, then why eat each other? Some researchers believe this hints at a different motive: intergroup violence, where the dead were not only killed but consumed as a final insult or assertion of dominance. This overlaps with a different form of cannibalism, exocannibalism, eating the enemy after battle as a show of power or spiritual conquest. We'll explore that further in another part of this story. For now, we return to survival cannibalism, the version that rattles us most deeply because it feels uncomfortably close to our own world. The difference between us and the Donner Party is not morality, it's infrastructure. It's modern food distribution, heating and shelter. But what if all that fell apart? What if we were stranded, starving, desperate? That's the terrifying truth behind survival cannibalism. It strips away all the social constructs and moral codes and leaves only the raw instinctive drive to live. It's not about being evil, it's about not dying. And history tells us, again and again, that when people are pushed to the edge, even the strongest taboos can break. The bones buried in ancient caves and the journals left behind in snowy cabins remind us, in the right or wrong circumstances, the line between human and food can vanish. And in that moment, we stop being witnesses to history. We become part of the same ancient, uncomfortable truth. Survival always has a cost, but survival wasn't the only reason humans turned to cannibalism. In fact, some of the most widespread and culturally accepted forms of cannibalism throughout history had nothing to do with hunger. They had everything to do with power, revenge, and the psychology of dominance. This is exocannibalism, the act of eating one's enemies. And unlike the desperate, tragic cases of survival cannibalism, this kind was intentional, ritualized, and at times even celebratory. It wasn't just about erasing your enemy, it was about consuming them, owning them, and transforming their body into a trophy of war. In societies where life was an ongoing struggle over territory, resources, or honor, enemies were more than just people. They were symbols. Threats, monsters in human form. Killing them was victory. But eating them, that was total domination. It sent a clear message: we didn't just defeat you, we erased you. You will not return, and your strength is now ours. Take the Tupinambá people of Brazil. When European explorers reached the shores of South America in the 16th century, they encountered a cultural system that shocked them to the core. A German mercenary, Hans Staden, was captured by the Tupinambá in 1552. For 9 agonizing months, he lived with them, sharing their homes, eating their food, and constantly fearing he would become their next feast. His published account became a sensation in Europe. While some of his descriptions were exaggerated for effect, many were supported by other witnesses and anthropological evidence. Staden described how the Tupinambá didn't immediately kill their captives. Instead, they honored them, gave them food, sometimes even assigned them wives. But make no mistake, this was not kindness. It was a theatrical build-up to a public execution. When the time came, a massive feast was prepared. The captive was expected to show bravery, taunt his captors, and speak proudly of his people, almost like a farewell performance. Then he was killed, cooked, and consumed by the entire tribe. It was ritual, it was symbolic, it was political. Why? Because, to the Tupinambá, eating their enemies was justice. It was the final step in a cycle of vengeance stretching across generations. It wasn't mindless violence, it was meaningful violence. It was about absorbing strength, passing judgment, and creating unity through shared experience. Everyone took part, everyone remembered. It was storytelling, punishment, and communion, all in one. This idea of eating enemies to absorb their essence is remarkably common around the world. Among the Fore people of Papua New Guinea, similar beliefs existed. They called it mana, a kind of spiritual energy that could be transferred through flesh. By consuming the dead, they believed they were inheriting that energy, reinforcing their own strength and that of the tribe. In war, this turned the battlefield into a spiritual contest, where taking a life wasn't the end of conflict, it was the beginning of ritual. And then there are the Aztecs, perhaps the most infamous practitioners of ritual cannibalism. Popular culture often focuses on the blood-soaked altars of the Templo Maya, where victims were sacrificed to gods like Huitzilopochtli, the deity of sun and war. But what came after the sacrifice is just as important. The body, drained of blood, was often dismembered. The limbs were given as rewards to the warriors who captured the victim. These weren't trophies to be mounted. They were cooked, stewed with maize, and eaten with honor. One controversial theory, popularized by anthropologist Marvin Harris, argued that this was about food, that the Aztec Empire used human meat to supplement a protein-deficient diet. Harris called the victims marching meat, soldiers turned into calories, but modern research has largely dismissed this view. The Aztecs had plenty of protein: beans, corn, amaranth, turkeys, fish, and even spirulina algae harvested from lakes. And ritual cannibalism wasn't widespread or random. It was highly controlled, tied to cosmology, social hierarchy, and religion. More likely, the act of consuming a sacrificed victim was a form of divine communion. Once the heart was offered to the gods, the body became sacred. Eating the flesh wasn't just symbolic, it was a spiritual transfer. You weren't just feeding your body, you were feeding your connection to the gods, reaffirming your role in the cosmic balance. And at the same time, it sent a terrifying message to outsiders. This is the fate of those who challenge us. Evidence of this kind of cannibalism, political, symbolic, and strategic, can be found far beyond the Americas. In Mozyka Cave in Poland, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 10 people, dated to about 18,000 years ago. These weren't victims of starvation. The area was rich in game and water, and yet these individuals, men, women, and children, had been brutally killed, scalped, defleshed, and butchered. Their bones bore knife marks, spiral fractures, and had been discarded among animal remains. There was no sign of burial, no sign of respect, just a mass of violence and consumption. This wasn't about need, it was about elimination. The victims may have been a rival group, wiped out in a prehistoric act of total war. And by consuming them, the victors did more than just kill them. They erased them from memory, from family, and from history. Their bones became trash, their identity gone. And this is where exocannibalism reveals its darkest truth. At its core, it's not about meat, it's about meaning. It's the weaponization of food, the transformation of the body into a message, a symbol of complete control. When a group eats their enemy, they are not just celebrating victory, they are performing it. They are rewriting the story of war in blood and bone. This practice draws from one of humanity's most powerful forces, group identity. The bonds that hold a tribe, a nation, or a people together can also create an invisible wall of hatred. When the other is seen not as human but as enemy, all bets are off. Violence becomes ritual, death becomes celebration, and the body once sacred becomes a tool of terror. Exocannibalism is not the opposite of civilization. It is part of it, a reflection of how far people will go to protect their group, preserve their honor, and punish their rivals. It is war extended into the realm of the sacred and the social, a dark, chilling reminder that beneath the surface of culture and tradition, the human instinct for dominance runs deep. and sometimes it ends with a feast. We've explored cannibalism born from hunger, and cannibalism born from war. Both, though disturbing, follow a certain brutal logic: survival, dominance, necessity. But now we step into territory that feels even more alien to the modern Western mind. A form of cannibalism rooted not in desperation or hatred, but in grief, love, and ritualized compassion. This is endo-cannibalism, the act of consuming one's own kin, usually as part of a funeral rite. And it is here that we uncover some of the most emotionally complex, ethically disorienting, and spiritually rich practices ever developed by human societies. To understand this, we must first let go of the way most modern cultures view death and the body. In much of the Western world, we see the body as a kind of container, a temporary shell that holds the soul or mind. When death comes, the self is believed to exit, and what remains is just matter, lifeless, empty, and quickly turned over to the earth or fire. Burial or cremation becomes a matter of disposal, tinged with dignity, but largely detached from the person who once was. But for many indigenous societies, especially in parts of the Amazon and Papua New Guinea, that separation between the body and the self does not exist. In those worldviews, the body is the person, and that person is not an isolated individual. They are a thread woven into the social fabric of family, kin, and clan. So when someone dies, the body isn't just a corpse. It's a living memory, a presence, and still part of the communal whole. The Wari people of the western Brazilian Amazon offer one of the most poignant examples of this. Until the 1960s, the Wari practiced mortuary cannibalism, a ritual that might seem horrifying to outsiders, but which they considered the highest form of respect for the dead. For the Wari, burying a body in the cold, wet ground, leaving it to rot in the dark earth, was not an act of dignity. It was a form of cruelty. It meant abandoning the person, letting them be consumed by worms and forgotten in silence. Instead, the warrior transformed the body through mourning and ritual. After days of grief and weeping, the in-laws of the deceased, never the direct blood relatives, would be asked to take on the sacred responsibility of consuming the flesh. The closest kin, like parents or children, were forbidden from eating, as it would feel like eating their own soul. But for the in-laws, it was a duty of compassion. The meat was roasted slowly and consumed solemnly, not as a feast, but as an act of grief. Some Wari would describe the act as physically nauseating, emotionally painful, but something they did because they loved the person who had died. The logic was deeply emotional. The warrior believed that as long as the body remained, it held the power to prolong suffering. Seeing the corpse was like reliving the moment of death again and again. But by consuming the body, they were transforming pain into remembrance. The person didn't disappear. They lived on inside the community, quite literally. Their body was returned to the living, becoming part of the people who loved them. This wasn't savagery. It was ritualized mourning at its most intimate. A similar logic can be found among the Fore people of the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea. Like the Wari, the Fore practiced funerary cannibalism, particularly among women and children, who were considered responsible for caring for the dead. The body of a deceased family member was prepared and eaten, not out of hunger, but out of devotion. Special care was given to the brain, thought to be a powerful repository of the individual's life force. Tragically, this ritual would become the source of one of the most mysterious epidemics in modern history. Starting in the early 20th century, a strange and fatal illness spread among the Fora. It was called kuru, meaning to shiver. Victims would lose motor control, burst into fits of involuntary laughter, and eventually succumb to death. For decades, scientists were baffled until Dr. Carleton Gajdusek linked the disease to the Fora's funeral customs. Kuru, it turned out, was caused by prions, misfolded proteins that infect the brain, like those responsible for mad cow disease. The act of eating infected human brains, especially by children and women who prepared the bodies, passed the disease from one generation to the next. But even after the cause was discovered, the meaning behind the ritual remained. The Forto didn't eat their dead out of barbarism. They did it out of loyalty. Letting a loved one be consumed by worms was horrifying to them. Letting that same loved one be taken in, remembered and digested by those who loved them, that was comfort. That was closure. Endo-cannibalism, then, is not about feeding the body. It's about feeding the soul of a community. It's a way of confronting death not with distance but with direct participation. And in doing so, these rituals turned death into something shared, intimate, and spiritually significant. The archaeological record gives us haunting glimpses of how far back these beliefs might go. In Gores Cave, England, dating to around 15,000 years ago, researchers uncovered something astonishing: human skulls carefully shaped into cups or bowls. Other bones bore human tooth marks, cut marks, and signs of deliberate defleshing. These weren't random acts of violence, they were part of a funeral tradition. The bones suggest a community that processed their dead with structure, care, and symbolism. Perhaps the drinking cups were used in memorial rituals, allowing the community to literally drink in the memory of the deceased. Even more fascinating, genetic studies of ancient European populations show that two distinct burial cultures existed side by side during the Ice Age. One group practiced formal burial, sealing the dead away beneath the ground. The other processed their dead through ritual cannibalism, possibly as a way of keeping them close. These weren't enemies, they were neighbors, and they held entirely different visions of what it meant to say goodbye. This is the true lesson of endo-cannibalism, that morality is not universal. What seems horrifying to one culture can be sacred to another. For the Wari, the Fordham, perhaps many forgotten peoples across time, cannibalism wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate expression of connection, a final gift, a way to say, you are not gone, you are with us, you are part of us. And so, in this final and most intimate form of cannibalism, we don't find monsters. We find mourners. We find families struggling to heal. We find the strange, beautiful ways humans make meaning out of death. From the desperate act of a starving pioneer to the sacred duty of a grieving relative, the story of cannibalism is so much more than a simple tale of savagery. It's a story of human adaptability, brutality, and incredible social complexity. We've seen how in the face of absolute starvation the most profound taboos can crumble under the simple biological need to live. We've journeyed into the heart of war, where eating an enemy became the ultimate expression of power and domination for groups like the Aztecs, a brutal but logical extension of conflict. And finally, we've ventured into the most alien territory of all, the world of compassionate cannibalism. For peoples like the Wari and the Four, eating their own dead was an act of profound love and respect, a way to manage grief and keep the community whole. The history of cannibalism forces us to confront the immense range of human behavior. It shows us that people, past and present, are capable of almost anything when driven by desperation, bound by conflict, or guided by a worldview entirely different from our own. The forgotten truth is that cannibalism isn't the sign of a people without a culture, it's the sign of a people with a culture, one whose logic can be deeply unsettling. It reminds us that the line between civilization and savagery, between the sacred and the profane, is not always as clear as we'd like to think. It's a stark testament to the fact that under the right pressures and with the right beliefs, humanity's oldest taboo can become a story of survival, a strategy of war, and even an act of love. If you found this exploration into our complex past as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We love continuing the conversation, so drop a comment below. What aspect of this topic did you find the most surprising? We try to read as many as we can. Thanks for watching.